Hello dear students, welcome to this video class. In this class, we are going to discuss the important characteristics of romantic poetry. Dear students, as you all know that we have already discussed about romanticism, how it was emerged in the various fields like literature, arts, music and other aspects of life. You all know that Romanticism commenced with the publication of lyrical ballads in 1798 by William Wordsworth and Coleridge. We have already discussed the major characteristics or major features of Romanticism in your previous classes. Dear students, you have to notice that there is a similarity between the characteristics of Romanticism and the characteristics of Romantic poetry. Both are same. So let us see the characteristics of Romantic poetry one by one. As you all know that Romantic poetry is the poetry of the Romantic era. Romanticism was also an artistic, literary, musical, and intellectual movement that originated in Europe toward the end of the 18th century. I already told you in your previous classes that it was a reaction against prevailing Enlightenment ideas of the 18th century and it lasted from 1800 to 1850. So, what are the major characteristics of English Romantic poetry? As you all know that Romanticism or Romantic poetry is a strong reaction against the poetry of neoclassical age. There were many hurdles to be faced by the writers. The writers were not given any freedom, a kind of suffocating atmosphere in that period. So, that atmosphere had been completely changed in Romantic poetry or Romantic age. So, here the poets, the prose writers, the novelists, the essayists had enjoyed all the liberty, all the freedom. So, they were able to write according to their wish and will. So, the characteristics when we come to the characteristics of the Romantic poetry, here we have the first characteristic of Romantic poetry is the sublime. Sublime was one of the major features of Romantic poetry. It was so important to the Romantics as they loved nature and anything having to having to do with nature. The Romantic writers believed that the sublime transcended the rational. That is, the feeling of awe and terror evoked by the sublime are beyond words, and the emotions that the sublime creates overwhelm rational thought. It is what the Romantics believed. The second characteristics of Romantic poetry is it was a reaction against told you that it is a revolt against neoclassical poetry. The neoclassical poetry was the product of intellect and reason, while Romantic poetry stressed on emotion and imagination. The third important feature of Romantic poetry is imagination. Imagination is a distinctive feature of romantic poetry. They try to create an imaginary world to get solace from the day to day worries of the life. For Wordsworth and William Blake, imagination is a spiritual force. It is related to morality, and they believed that literature, especially poetry, could improve the world when it is combined with imagination. Even John Keats, Coleridge, Shelley, these poets used their imagination to bring some quality, some solace to the sufferings of the people of that particular age. The fourth characteristic of romantic poetry is nature, depiction of nature, or we can call it as nature poetry. Dear students, you all know that William Wordsworth, is considered as the nature is the mother of man. Man has to learn from many things from nature. We need to be we need to develop a healthy relationship with nature. He was worried that man is getting detached from nature. In his famous poem, The World is Too Much with Us, he says that man is busy in getting and spending. It is useless. He says, mere getting and spending is not the life. When man comes in contact with nature, he will get so many beautiful lessons for his life. So, love for nature is another important and distinctive feature of romantic poetry. They try to create an imaginary world to get solace from the day to day worries. So, they worshipped nature. Nature for them was a source of inspiration. They urged the people to be in touch with nature always. Wordsworth recognized nature as a living thing, teacher, God, and everything. These feelings are fully developed and expressed in all his poems. The fourth characteristics of romantic poetry is melancholy. There are some melancholy of the sorrow moments are the key elements which can be noticed in the poems of Wordsworth and other writers. Medievalism. Romantic poetry was attracted to medievalism, especially in the poems of John Keats. We can see the depiction of medieval art and life. Coleridge also showed an interest in medievalism in his poems. They were attracted to exotic, remote, and obscure places, and so they were more attracted to Middle Ages than to their own age. Poems like Ode on a Grecian Urn. Here, John Keats tried to depict the medieval art. This, the next characteristics of romantic poetry is Hellenism. Hellenism is a kind of Greece culture which was adored much by the romantic writers. John Keats' poetry is full of allusions to the art, literature and culture of Greek, as for example, in Ode on a Grecian urn, he depicts that culture. Supernaturalism. Majority of the Romantic writers used supernatural elements in their poetry. Coleridge is the lead. The Rime of Ancient Mariner and Christabel are full of supernatural elements. Subjectivity is another important characteristic of Romantic poetry. Romantic poetry is known for its subjectivity. It is the poetry of sentiments, emotions, and imagination. The Romantic poets condemned objectivity of neoclassical poetry. Neoclassical writers avoided describing their personal emotions in their poetry, unlike the Romantics. But the Romantic writers gave importance to subjectivity in their poems. The, the 10th characteristics of Romantic poetry is back from set rules. The poetry of the Romantic period is a revolt against neoclassical poetry, which was governed by strict rules and regulations. There were certain set ideals for poetry in 18th century, and any deviation from the rules was not accepted by the teachers of poetic thought. The Romantic poets broke all these rules and started subjective writing. They wrote poetry in free style without following any rules and regulations. They gave importance to they gave importance to simplicity of language, common diction, classical poetry. The next characteristics of Romantic poetry is interest in rural life. If the poetry of the 18th century was concerned with the clubs and coffee houses, drawing rooms, and social and political life of London, the poetry of Romantic age concentrated on rustic life. Depiction of rural folk, peasantry, sheep, and lakes were the main themes of Romantic poetry. In Romantic poetry, the interest transformed from town life to rural life, and from the artificial decorations of the drawing rooms to the natural beauty and loveliness of nature. Presentation of common life. Unlike the neoclassical writers, the Romantic writers discarded the sophisticated class of the society. They took an interest in the lives of common people, the shepherds and other cottages. Their renewed interest in the simple life marked the poetry of the poets of Romantic age. A feeling of humanitarianism colored in the poetry of Wordsworth, Shelley, and Byron. Romantic poetry was also marked by interest by intense human sympathy and a consequent understanding of the human heart. Love of liberty and freedom was the outbreak of the French Revolution. The famous slogans of the revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, influenced much on the writings of Romantic poets. An emphasis was laid on liberty and freedom of individual in Romantic poetry. Romantic poets were rebels against tyranny and brutality. Some romantic poets felt irritated with the tyranny and ugliness of materialistic life of their age, and to avoid the life of uneasy, restless. So these are all the important characteristics of romantic poetry, dear students. If you want more information regarding this, you can refer two important books. One is History of English Literature by David Duchess, and another one is History of English Literature by Edward Albert. Thank you, one and all.